After returning to Fortune Street and engaging in a brief fight with Song Changjing, Bai Yuan didn't stay in the Li clan's residence for too long. He sprinted out of the small town and came to a momentary stop where Chen Ping'an had entered the mountain. Bai Yuan then chose to retreat to where he had thrown the punch before, and he carefully examined the footprints that Chen Ping'an had left in the mud. Apart from Chen Ping'an's footprints, Bai Yuan also noticed the shallower footprints of an adult. He speculated that these footprints were most likely left by the young swordsman from Wan Lightning Field. When he had thrown a punch at Chen Ping'an, that young man had clearly wanted to seize the opportunity to attack him, with his sword intent leaking for a split second. However, he had immediately suppressed it, and most people wouldn't have noticed anything untoward. However, Bai Yuan had experienced countless battles, and he had also cultivated for 1,000 years in Sun-Scorched Mountain, which possessed a sweeping sword che that can cut through the treasure vial. Thus, he was far too familiar with sword intent and sword chen. Bai Yuan had lived for a long time, so he had naturally seen and experienced many things as well. He had seen sword immortals, who were skilled in nurturing top-notch flying swords, and there were those who possessed dozens of mini flying swords that could fit in their sleeves. These were flying swords that were as small and fine as hair. He had also seen a bonded flying sword that was as large as a mountain, with its power so immense that it could sever a river with a single slash. Bai Yuan stopped and contemplated for a while before deciding to continue forward. The foot of the mountain was filled with overgrown grass, and after a while, he was greeted by the sight of a bamboo forest. The ground was filled with withered leaves from last autumn and winter. However, because this closest bamboo forest was the closest to the small town, it didn't appear too desolate or disorderly. Following the vaguely perceptible footprints, the old ape discovered that he was soon going to exit the bamboo forest. However, Bai Yuan chose not to directly exit the bamboo forest, and he instead observed his surroundings. He found that there were no more footsteps from the young boy. He looked up at the stalks of green bamboo, and he found that there were no marks on these either. Even so, Bai Yuan still refused to directly climb the mountain to give chase. Instead, he leapt up and landed on the tip of a thick bamboo stalk with a single foot, slightly exerting some force and causing his body to lean forward. The bamboo bowed, and just as it was about to snap, Bai Yuan suddenly retracted his aura and caused his body to become as light as a feather. With no more weight on it, the bamboo instantly shot back upright, like an immortal soaring through the wind. Bai Yuan stood on the tip of the bamboo stalk and gently swayed with it. Observing the surroundings as he did so, he looked down, and he finally discovered a small clue. The corners of his mouth curled up, and he turned to his left and peered into the distance. Pricking up his ears, he could hear the faint sound of flowing water in the distance. Bai Yuan smiled coldly and said, "As cunning as always." Using the stalks of green bamboo as footholds, Bai Yuan sprinted toward the small creek to his left, leaving a trail of snapped bamboo stalks in his wake. He stopped again after arriving at the creek, unsure of whether Chen Ping'an had traversed deeper into the mountain forests, or whether he had fled downstream. His brows were knitted in a deep frown, and there was a slight hint of anger on his face. If this were a mountain with some spiritual energy in the outside world, Bai Yuan could have made a grabbing motion with his hand and easily forced the god of the land to show himself and accept his orders. A simple question, and he would have been able to learn Chen Ping'an's whereabouts. This was also one of Bai Yuan's innate mystical abilities. Otherwise, regardless of how powerful or mighty a cultivator was, they definitely wouldn't have the ability to order the local god of the land or god of water around. This was quite similar to the empires and imperial courts of the mortal world, where it was extremely difficult for the Minister of War to command a measly external official from the Ministry of Revenue. Most importantly, the Minister of War and the external official from the Ministry of Revenue weren't even from the same imperial court. Bai Yuan fell deep into thought as he listened to the sound of the flowing water. Thinking from a logical perspective, Chen Ping'an had most likely developed his skills and stamina by climbing the mountains and swimming through the creeks from a young age. Perhaps he had even experimented with elementary breathing techniques before, and maybe it was because of this that he possessed such an exceptional physique. With his body light and his bones sturdy, This then allowed him to play the cat and mouse game with Bai Yuan on the rooftops. If this were the case, it made sense for Chen Ping'an to venture deeper into the dense forest to find a hiding spot. If he were nothing more than an ordinary young boy, however, then he had most likely been acting on an impulse to seek revenge before. After witnessing Bai Yuan's strength and calming down a little, it would only be natural for him to feel a sense of lingering fear. As such, it would be no surprise if he ran to the blacksmith shop in the south to seek protection from Master Ruin. If Chen Ping'an had chosen the former option, this would only waste some of his time. If Chen Ping'an had chosen the latter option, however, this would waste not only his strength and energy, but it might even use up some of Sun-Scorched Mountain's goodwill. Bai Yuan uttered his sincere thoughts at this moment, saying, Chen Ping'an must die. He didn't hesitate any longer, and chose to venture downstream to look for Chen Ping'an. There was a winding mud road to the south of the small town, and both sides of it were decorated with the rice paddies and croplands of the town residents. Halfway up the winding road, there was a rundown temple with white walls and black roof tiles. It was called a temple, but in reality, it was nothing more than a resting spot for the residents. This was especially the case when the weather became scorching hot, or when the heavens unleashed torrential rain upon them. During these times, it would make a huge difference whether there was a resting spot or not. Right now, Chen Ping'an and Ning Yang were resting and discussing their plans here. Ning Yang was born a sword prodigy, and she could easily see things even in the dark. This allowed her to quickly discover the childish graffiti on the broken walls of the temple, written using charcoal crayons. Most of the graffiti was the names of people. The characters near the bottom of the wall had already become smudged and unclear, and perhaps they had been rubbed off or written over by others. Only the characters higher up were still clear and intact, and she could easily make out the names of several people. Song Jixen, Zigui, Zhao Yao, Xi Shai, Cao Shi, and so on. Perhaps they had sat or even stood on the shoulders of their friends to write their names up so high. In fact, Ning Yao even saw Liu Xianxia, Chen Ping'an, and Gouken's names written on the uppermost left corner of the wall. Their names appeared slightly distant and disjointed from the rest of the names. Ning Yao retracted her gaze and said, No matter what, we successfully completed the first stage of our plan. We forced that old ape to replenish his Che once. Anyway, are you really planning to return to the small town to retrieve your wooden bow? Wouldn't that be too risky? What if the old ape is extremely cautious and didn't go up the mountain to look for you? Won't you be running straight into his maw? Chen Ping'an was quietly practicing his breathing technique, with the length of each inhalation and exhalation varying depending on his feeling. What he saw was the most comfortable state. Hearing Ning Yao's question, he replied with a resolute expression, I have no choice. I have to retrieve my wooden bow. Otherwise, we would have wasted all our previous efforts. Moreover, just like you said, shooting him is useless unless I can hit him in the eye. I shot him from close range in Clay Valley, but the damage it caused was negligible. Ning Yao was slightly irritated, and she said, I already told you, your trifling skills are useless against him. You didn't believe me before, and you stubbornly insisted on doing things your way. So I said fine, and I let you do things your way. Since you believe me now, it's time to follow my plans. Right. Regarding how to deal with Bai Yuan, Chen Ping'an and Ning Yao had initially decided to each do their own thing during their discussion on the covered bridge. Chen Ping'an had simply told Ning Yao to wait for him to talk to 3 people first. However, he had suddenly changed his mind, and he had caught up to Ning Yao just as she reached the steps on the northern end of the covered bridge. Afterward, the two of them had a huge disagreement. Since Chen Ping'an wasn't a cultivator and couldn't even practice a simple fist technique, Ning Yao insisted that he stay out of it and simply observe things from the sidelines. If he wanted to, he could clap and cheer her on if she killed the old ape and exacted revenge for Liu Xianxia. However, when Chen Ping'an had asked her about the details, Ning Yao had refused to elaborate on how she would kill Bai Yuan. She simply said that she had a powerful trump card. Otherwise, without some trump cards, how could she go on an adventure through the world? Hearing this, Chen Ping'an had rejected her proposal. Afterward, he had gone to look for the 3 people. Chen Ping stood up and stretched his back, with his movements barely inhibited anymore. All right, that should be enough rest. Ning Yao was astonished, and she said, the medicine from the Yang family's medicine shop is that effective. A hint of despondence flashed through Chen Ping's eyes. However, he quickly nodded and said with a smile, yes, it's very effective. Will the old ape see through your escape plan? Ning Yao asked. Chen Ping pondered for a moment before cautiously replying, possibly. Ning Yao used the scabbard of her saber to draw the circles and the line in the dirt before asking, this is the path between this temple and the Li clan's residence on Fortune Street. Where is your wooden bow hidden? Chen Ping squatted down and drew a circle, saying, it's near the east. Around here. It's not too far from Clay Vase Alley. Ning Yao nodded and said, all right then. Even if that old ape directly comes here, I'll engage with him and try to buy enough time for you. Chen Ping drew another small circle in the middle of the line, and he said, Ning Yao, if the worst-case scenario really does play out, can you lead him to this place? This is where I entered the mountain before. If you guys are there, then it won't take me too long to head over after I retrieve my wooden bow. The young girl in green leaned on her saber and said in a proud voice, perhaps I'll be waiting for you with the old ape's head in my hand at that time. Chen Ping shook his head and said, don't try to show off. You need to be careful. Ning Yao genuinely wanted to wrap his head with the scabbard of her saber. Just who was trying to show off? She glared at him and exclaimed, boy, the person standing in front of you is Ning Yao. Someone who's going to become the #1 sword immortal in the world in the future. Understood. Chen Ping stood up before glancing down to check the 2 patches of coins on his waist as a precaution. He tightened them again. He then looked up and said, yes, I understand that, so you definitely can't die in a small place like this, right? Otherwise, just how unfortunate would that be? As your friend, when you become a powerful and mighty sword immortal in the future, I'll also be able to bask in your glory. Ning Yao sighed with emotion and said, Chen Ping, you're as fussy as an old woman and you're also so hesitant and indecisive. I suggest that you don't look for a wife in the future. Just marry some random girl and call it a day. Chen Ping didn't retort her, and he simply replied with a chuckle. Just as he was about to leave the temple, Ning Yao said, I'll go with you to the creek first. After that, I'll head northwest to avoid having that old ape become worried about the little girl. Otherwise, what will we do if he doesn't find you after leaving the bamboo first and therefore decides to give up and return to the small town? Chen Ping thought about this for a moment, and he didn't reject Ning Yao's proposal. They ran toward the creek. Ning Yao's breathing was like the flowing water of a magnificent river with incredible depth and surging undercurrents, while Chen Ping's breathing was like the flowing water of a creek that was long and steady. Their auras were vastly different. Ning Yao suddenly couldn't contain her urge, and she asked, will the herbal medicine you want to apply to the arrowhead really be effective? Well, it's effective against wild boars that weigh over 100 kilograms. So I assume that it should be effective against that old ape as well. Chen Ping replied. Ning Yao didn't say anything else. When they arrived in front of the creek, this was the location where Chen Ping had come on shore before. They both bent their knees and leapt up at almost the exact same instant, flying through the air and landing on the opposite side. Ning Yao slowed down and grabbed her scabbard after landing. Meanwhile, after sprinting and leaping over the creek, Chen Ping continued to dash forward in a continuous motion, instantly overtaking the young girl. Just as she was about to turn around, Ning Yao said, don't worry about me. You return to the small town first. As Chen Ping continued to forge ahead, he glanced back and said, I'm going to take a detour and find the quieter alley to enter the small town, so I might return a bit later. Ning Yao nodded in understanding. When Chen Ping disappeared into the distance, she let go of her sword hilt and started to walk slowly toward the west. After a short while, she came to a stop and peered into the distance at the upper reaches of the creek. A tall and burly figure suddenly leapt off a large rock in the creek and shot toward its northern banks, landing 20 or so steps away from the young girl. His aura was intense and domineering, however. Bai Yuan was slightly puzzled, as he couldn't sense Chen Ping's aura in the surroundings. He unconsciously glanced at the sword by Ning Yao's waist, and he said with a smile, "Young girl, you are the person who caused the reckless in Fortune Street a short while ago, correct?" Ning Yao remained silent as she rested her hands on her sword hilt and saber hilt. Yuan wore a curious expression as he said, "Young girl, even though you hid your identity the entire time while we were coming to the small town, I can tell that your background isn't simple. You're definitely not like the trash from Light Breeze City and Old Dragon City. However, what puzzles me is why you're targeting me like this. Even though there's no grievance or grudge between us, or perhaps someone from your clan or sect has grudges against Sunscorched Mountain." Ning Yao didn't say a word as she unsheathed her sword and saber in unison. Leaping forward in a flash, the slender saber arrived first, slashing down at Bai Yuan's head. Bai Yuan casually raised an arm to forcefully deflect the blow. Ning Yao used this momentum to spin around, slashing her sword at the old ape's neck as she did so. Bai Yuan once again used his arm to forcefully block this strike. After failing to take Bai Yuan down with her two strikes, Ning Yao didn't choose to further engage in close-quarter combat. Instead, she created some distance between them before slowly pacing around. After using his incredibly powerful physique to gauge the sharpness of Ning Yao's weapons, Bai Yuan ignored the bloody gashes on his forearm and said with a smile, "Your weapons are fairly impressive. Moreover, you dare to carry two of them around with you. So it's quite clear that you're the disciple of an impressive sect from the mountains. Otherwise, you're the direct disciple of a first-rate power outside the mountains. In fact, I almost thought you were another swordsman from one lightning field, one who was lying low." Tracking the pacing young girl with his gaze, Bai Yuan said in a solemn voice, "Young girl, I know that you won't give up even if you fail in a moment. So I'll give you one last chance to reveal your identity and background before I kill you. However, Sunscorched Mountain won't apologize because of this matter, nor will it care where you're from and what your identity is." Ning Yao completely ignored his remarks from the beginning to the end. She was observing him and looking for his weak points. After all, she wasn't Song Changjing, someone who had already discovered the path to the 10th tier. She couldn't face this mountain-moving ape head-on, feeling like he had already conceded too much ground. Bai Yuan chuckled coldly and said, "Since you're unwilling to accept my kindness, then so be it." Bai Yuan arrived before Ning Yao in a single stride, raising his arm and forming a fist before hammering down at her head. Ning Yao raised her saber to block this attack, with the blade of her saber facing Bai Yuan's wrist. At the same time, she viciously thrust her sword at his chest, with the tip of the sword pointing at his heart. Surprisingly, however, Bai Yuan's fist opened up into a palm, and he nimbly grabbed the blade of her saber. Meanwhile, his other hand instinctively shot over to grab the tip of her sword. It was clear that his attack had only been a facade, with his true intention being to invite a careless attack from Ning Yao. As someone from Sunscorched Mountain, a holy land for swordsmen in Eastern Treasure Vile Continent, Bai Yuan was naturally able to tell that this sword was extraordinary with a single glance. In order to grab it, he had even been willing to replenish his chi for a second time. In fact, the tip of the sword had already pierced through his chest, and it was only an inch or so away from penetrating his heart. Seeing that she was in a precarious situation, Ning Yao resolutely let go of her sword. At the same time, she forcefully tugged at her saber, causing it to slide through Bai Yuan's grip and emit a piercing scraping sound, like that of metal against rock. After freeing her saber, Ning Yao quickly leapt back and retreated. Sure enough, the old ape turned around and flicked his wrist, causing the sword to fly dozens of meters away. He then launched a kick at the young girl. Ning Yao raised her right hand, which was non-empty, and with a thump, she was struck by Bai Yuan's kick and sent flying 20 meters into the distance. She landed heavily on her back, and only after taking a few tumbles did she finally manage to dig her saber into the ground and halt her momentum. Thankfully, the earth near the banks of the creek was relatively soft and loose, and the rocks on the ground were also round and smooth instead of jagged and sharp. It was because of this that her back didn't become a bloody and mangled mess. Bai Yuan didn't give her any time to rest. With his large body soaring forward and slamming down from the sky, Ning Yao didn't even have time to retrieve her saber from the ground as she retreated again and again. Bai Yuan didn't continue to pursue her, and after landing, he raised a foot and stomped on the hilt of her saber. When the young girl, who was down on one knee, looked up, Bai Yuan increased the force underfoot and sent the saber deep into the earth. With its hilt drawn level with the ground, a golden purple aura fluctuated near the old ape's face, and it appeared especially dazzling when juxtaposed against the darkness of the night sky. He sneered and said, "You practice the sword, yet you also practice the saber, causing your techniques to become disorderly and unrefined. It's inevitable that you're in such a miserable situation." Ning Yao stood up and forcefully stopped herself from vomiting a mouthful of blood before saying, "Is that all you've got?" Bai Yuan shook his head and said with a smile, "I was only giving you one last chance." Ning Yao took a deep breath before saying in a solemn voice, "In my hometown, we don't care about who someone's parents are when we fight against them. If someone has the ability to kill you fair and square, then you can only blame yourself for being too weak and inferior. If my parents learn of this in the future, they'll at most only come to Eastern Treasure Vile Continent to target you. They definitely won't target Sun-Scorched Mountain. So, you can be at ease and fight me with your full strength." This was the first time Bai Yuan had seen her being so talkative, and she appeared completely different from the young girl with the veiled head who was reserved and didn't show many emotions. Bai Yuan suddenly felt a cold chill at the back of his neck at this instant, and this caused him to immediately turn his head to the side. A blade scraped past his neck, leaving a shallow wound. If he hadn't turned his head, the sword would have severely wounded him even if it couldn't directly run through his neck. At that time, the tables would turn on him, and he would eventually fall to a bigger and bigger disadvantage. Moreover, if he revealed his true form too early, he would lose his moral high ground and thus lose his bargaining chip against Che Jingchen and Master Ruin. Perhaps this would even affect his young mistress and lead her to face all kinds of danger by herself. With this in mind, Bai Yuan finally became enraged for a third time. The flying sword didn't return to its sheath, and it instead flew around Ning Yao, as if it were trying to ask for praise and also please her. Bai Yuan left in anger upon seeing this, and he said, "Very well. I wasn't able to fight to my heart's content with Song Changjing just then, so I guess I'll play around with you for a little while. However, just how many heavy strikes can your fragile body withstand?" Ning Yao frowned slightly as she observed the golden-purple aura around Bai Yuan's face. Even though he had already used his mystical abilities 3 times, it was clear that he still had some remaining strength at the very least. His acupoints hadn't collapsed and forced him to reveal his true form. Moreover, having one's lifespan shortened would be a huge blow to those below the upper 5 tiers, but it would be much less of a blow to this mountain-moving ape, even though it would still be painful. Ning Yao moved her finger slightly, causing her sword to spin in an agile manner. She smiled and said, "No wonder my father said that Eastern Treasured Vile Continent Sun-Scorched Mountain isn't worth a mention. The cultivators there talk big, but have little skills to back up their boasts. You people have blind courage, but you're unfortunately stupid and have extremely shallow sword chain." Bai Yuan flared up in rage, and he bellowed, "You're seeking death." He charged at the impudent young girl. Ning Yao didn't zealously continue to fight, and Jin instead retreated toward the north. Her situation remained precarious, and if it wasn't for her flying sword receiving 2 characters from the plague unmatched aura, allowing it to grow explosively in sword che and spirit, she would have faced many more life-threatening situations. Now, however, the flying sword was linked to Ning Yao's mind, and this allowed her to control it with her thoughts. It was because of this that she was able to block many of the old ape's vicious attacks. If this were a bonded weapon that she had spent a huge amount of effort to nurture, Bai Yuan wouldn't have been astonished at all. However, he knew very clearly that this definitely wasn't the strange young girl's bonded sword. She seemed more like an ordinary martial artist who was traveling through the world with a convenient weapon in her hand. All that she cared about was the sharpness of her blade. She didn't care about nurturing her sword heart, nor did she care about nurturing a sword spirit. However, what was strange about her was that she wasn't fully walking the path of a martial artist either. This was because martial artists, who focused on tempering their physiques, yearned to reach a state of remaining indestructible. Even as heaven and earth shattered, if their weapons took over and gained the ability to act on their own, they would be regarded as disreputable martial artists from heretical sects. After chasing Ning Yao for so long, Bai Yuan was unable to capture her partly because of the flying sword, and partly because she had practiced so many different arts. She practiced sword arts, martial arts, and also cultivation. Bai Yuan racked his brains, but he truly couldn't think of a sect in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent that could raise such a strange disciple. Thus, he became increasingly careful with his attacks as he attempted to ascertain her identity and background. In any case, everything would be fine as long as they didn't get too close to the small town. Regardless of how messy things were there, Bai Yuan wouldn't face any dangers in this place. Ning Yao became increasingly pale as she continued to flee. "You're a spent force," Bai Yuan said with a wicked smile, not to say nothing of whether you can flee back to the small town. "Even if you can, and there's someone there to help you, do you really think that I can kill you?" Bai Yuan stamped his feet and leapt up, ignoring the flying sword and directly jumping over Ning Yao's head, landing in front of her and blocking her path. He then swung his fist and sent the flying sword spinning hundreds of meters into the distance. However, the irritating flying sword instantly soared back again and stabbed at his head. When Bai Yuan tried to grab the flying sword and hold it still, it slightly retreated from his reach as if it could read his mind. Coming and going like the wind, the flying sword was extremely unpredictable and hard to defend against. Even though Bai Yuan wasn't afraid of being wounded thanks to his strong physique, he was still left in a slightly disheveled state thanks to the flying sword. Ning Yao wasn't willing to face Bai Yuan head-on, so she changed her direction and started to run toward the northeast. Bai Yuan changed directions along with her, threatening her no matter where she went. He swatted aside the flying sword that was speeding toward him, as if he was swatting a fly, causing it to pierce almost a meter into the ground. Like a young girl swaying her hips, the flying sword swayed back and forth as it pulled itself from the ground with much difficulty. Hovering in the air, its tip shattered violently as if it were a furious little kitten. After pausing for a brief moment, it viciously stabbed at the old ape again. Bai Yuan was incredibly annoyed, and he couldn't help but say, "Why is this flying sword allowed to ignore the rules of this place? Tell me, what's your relationship with Xianxia or Ruin Qian?" Ning Yao was almost struck in the forehead by the old ape. As she leaned back, she reached out to grab the hilt of her flying sword, which forcefully dragged her back and out of the range of Bai Yuan's attacks. After retreating some distance, Ning Yao decided against retreating all the way to the small town for some reason. Instead, she stopped and stood still, cocking her head and spitting out a mouthful of blood. The flying sword rang continuously as it hovered beside the young girl, and it was as if it were a young and puzzled student who was rattling away to his elders and asking a million questions. Ning Yao placed her right hand on her left shoulder, though Bai Yuan suddenly slowed down, laughing heartily and saying, "Just as I expected, this flying sword recognizes you as its owner, and it can indeed act against the rules of this place. However, it's only a flying sword after all, and even if it has its own spirit, it can only do so much without your command. However, it's a shame that both your body and your soul were severely wounded in the small town, and you're still yet to recover from these injuries. As such, you're completely unable to command your flying sword. It's because of this that your attacks have been random and disjointed. It's also why you're allowing your flying sword to attack by itself. In any case, you were never genuinely trying to wound me in the first place. However, when it comes to life-saving defensive techniques, you have no option but to control the flying sword with your mind." Ning Yao finally spoke again, saying, "You speak so much." Her lips were sanguine red, and her face was as pale as a sheet. Standing before the backdrop of the night sky, the young girl in green looked much like a female ghost who was wandering around the wilderness of the small town. Bai Yuan strode forward, clicking his tongue in wonder as he said, "You have a powerful flying sword, but it's a shame that your body is too weak to fully control it. You're just like a tree with powerful branches but a weak trunk. How pitiful." You and that young boy from the alley read your brains to come up with ways to force me to replenish my Jian, such that I'll invite retribution from this heaven and if that young girl. Why don't you take a guess? After I exhaust this third breath of Qi and replenish my Qi for a fourth time, will I invite the wrath of heaven and earth? And will I be able to endure that wrath? An amused smile suddenly spread across Ning Yao's face as she lightly tapped her feet and jumped back. She only jumped up less than 3 meters, and she only jumped back less than 2 meters. Bai Yuan, who was just about to attack her, couldn't help but find this odd. Afraid that there was a trap, he continued to advance in a slow and cautious manner, keeping his eyes peeled for any sudden changes. While she was in midair, Ning Yao lightly tapped her feet again, this time exerting a little more power and also twisting her toes, causing her to jump to the side instead of straight back dart as it turned out. The flying sword had already flown beneath her feet while she was still in midair, allowing her to use it as a platform and continue to jump high and also further back. Even Bai Yuan, who had seen many things and experienced many battles, faltered upon seeing this. This was a strange and slightly physical sight, like a small miller playing hopscotch. Ning Yao continued to hop around in a graceful and lively manner, though it wasn't long before she vanished in the night sky. Moreover, perhaps afraid that the old ape would suddenly attack her, Ning Yao's movements appeared extremely random and unpredictable, sometimes jumping to the left, and sometimes jumping to the right, sometimes jumping higher, and sometimes jumping lower, sometimes jumping forward, and sometimes jumping back. Bai Yuan pursed his lips, his expression extremely complicated as he said, just like a bounding antelope. However, he didn't stand still as he watched her flee. With a flick of his foot, he casually kicked up a stone and caught it in his palm. With a swing, he then ferociously launched the stone into the air, one after another. Bai Yuan continued to flick stones into his hands before viciously throwing them at Ning Yao. Even though most of the stones missed, there were still 7 or 8 that greatly threatened Ning Yao, forcing her to control her sword to shatter them, like the rumbling thunder of spring. Explosions intermittently reverberated through the air. Bai Yuan's expression became dark. This young girl had either gone crazy, or she was absolutely stupid. She was clearly able to fly beyond the range of his stones, yet she insisted on maintaining the same height. She was like a lightly armored cavalry pacing back and forth along the edges of the battlefield, tempting the enemy archers to continuously waste their arrows and strength on her. Before he knew it, they had already arrived near the west side of the small town. Bai Yuan roughly estimated how much Qi he had remaining. It wasn't much. He then picked out 2 egg-sized stones, one in each hand, before striding forward and swinging an arm, his muscles bulging as he did so. This was an astonishing sight, and the stone surprisingly crackled as it soared through the air, leaving a trail of sparks behind it. This was extremely peculiar, and it was as if it was a slender fire dragon that was soaring into the sky. Get down here! Bai Yuan roared. A brilliant spark exploded in the air before a low rumble traveled over. Ning Yao groaned as she plummeted toward the ground, flying erratically like a drunkard. The flying sword whimpered in grief as it tried its best to help its owner. Bai Yuan didn't spare the young girl and flying sword so much as a glance, and he instead squinted his eyes as he peered at the rooftops to the west of the small town. When a streak of black flash passed, he forcefully stomped his feet and released the remaining stone, chortling with laughter and saying, "Trying to save her. You die first." Ning Yao vomited blood and screamed, "Don't come over." The heavily wounded young girl couldn't bring herself to look over Dao at this moment. She felt a slight sense of despair. She held onto her sword with much difficulty, and when one arm became too tired, she would hurriedly switch to the other arm. Though she did this again and again, slowing herself down as she fell to the ground. Ning Yao never imagined that it would be her clever act that would kill Chen Ping'an, the young boy in straw sandals who had a bamboo basket on his back and a fish basket by his waist. The young boy who walked as briskly as the wind as he hurried about every day, busily earning money and busily brewing medicine. To die just like this. Ning Yao felt like this wasn't right. After shakily landing on the ground, She put her index finger and middle finger together to form a sword. She then placed her fingers on her glabella and said through gritted teeth, "Come out. Shatter this heaven and earth." A thin golden line materialized on her glabella, slowly growing and expanding downward. This was just like an immortal opening the heavenly eye. Under the ancient stone arch bridge, the covered bridge of today. A rusty blade, whose tip had been pointing toward the deep pool for thousands of years, suddenly yawned like someone who had just woken up from a deep slumber. The rusty blade shuddered slightly. The covered bridge shuddered along with it. The entire creek also shuddered. The entire small world also shuddered. Deep in a mountain, a travel-worn Xianxia was walking with several other people. As he peacefully walked through the mountain, he suddenly raised a foot and was just about to forcefully stomp down. However, he suddenly smiled and gently lowered his foot. Sitting next to an oil lamp in the Yang family's medicine shop, Old Man Yang was suddenly roused from his nap. He tapped the table with his tobacco pipe. Standing in his official residence, Xianxia suddenly started to stamp his feet and cursed in a blacksmith shop by the creek. Ruan Tian surprisingly missed the sword billet and swung down with his hammer, causing an expression of shock to spread across the face of the young girl, who was holding a sword billet for him. Lying on a rooftop and gazing at the night sky, Markak Xuan, who was treated as a retard by everyone, suddenly sat up straight, with killing intent bursting from his body. Right at this moment, a familiar and extremely worried voice suddenly rang out, drawing closer and closer to Ning Yao. "Ning Yao, why are you stupidly standing there? Run! I'm not dead. That was just a shit that I took off. That old beast is stupid. But why have you gone stupid as well?" Ning Yao's mind was already fuzzy at this moment, with the edict ceremony almost reaching completion. However, she suddenly felt like she was taken on a ride through the clouds and mists as someone tossed her onto their shoulder and ran toward the alleyway. Ning Yao suddenly came to her senses, with her body bouncing up and down with the movement of champing on his shoulder. She felt slightly uncomfortable, and she felt even more embarrassed. She was completely stupefied as she murmured, "How?